Otradi would like to acknowledge the land we're all on, wherever we may be. Otradi conducts business throughout Portland and beyond and is making an effort to acknowledge the history of the area and work toward decolonization of the bioscience industry. Portland rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who have made their homes along the Columbia River. So please join us in acknowledging the land we're all on throughout Portland and beyond. To learn more about Portland's native, diverse, and vibrant community, please read Leading with Tradition. It's a document created by the Portland Indian Leaders Roundtable, and there is a link to it in the chat. So we want to thank CAMBIA Health for sponsoring this Equity and Leadership series, and we truly appreciate their being here today. We're very thankful for them. CAMBIA is dedicated to making their healthcare experience simpler, better, and more affordable for people and their families, including the 3.3 million people they serve through their regional health plans. CAMBIA is deeply rooted in a 100-year legacy of transforming the industry and the way people experience healthcare, and they're committed to delivering a seamless, personalized healthcare experience for the next 100 years. Please welcome Michael-Ann Benshoff to speak on CAMBIA's behalf. Michael-Ann, please go ahead.
Thank you, Renee. Hello, everyone. We're honored to be a sponsor of the series and excited to participate in this really important conversation today. And I just want to kick us off with a brief introduction to CAMBIA. Renee already hit on some highlights, but also reference our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you can advance to the next slide, Renee. Thank you. So CAMBIA is based in Portland, Oregon, and we are a family of companies. We're working to make healthcare simpler, better, and more affordable for individuals and their families. Our 6 regional health plans, Health Policy Center, Echo Health Ventures Investment Arm, and the CAMBIA Health Foundation are all united by our cause, which is to serve as a catalyst to transform healthcare. Through our health plans, we serve more than 3.4 million people across a 4-state footprint. So that's Oregon, Idaho, Utah, and Washington. We're a tax-paying nonprofit, and we have over 4,500 employees across 30 states. CAMBIA and our employees are nationally recognized for our culture of ethics, our focus on our members, and our commitment to DEI. We have a score of 100 on the Human Rights Campaign Foundation's 2022 Corporate Equality Index. Next slide, please. Our regional health plans are focused on improving the healthcare experience. We really want to give people more control, provide superior service, and make healthcare clearer, and focus on results that matter to people. Our investment arm, Echo Health Ventures, is a collaboration of CAMBIA Health Solutions, Mosaic Health Solutions, US Able Corporation, and Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee to accelerate healthcare innovation on a national scale. Our corporate foundation, CAMBIA Health Foundation, has funded over $110 million in grants to advance person-focused and economically sustainable healthcare. And through our Health Policy Center, we collaborate with thought leaders across the industry to promote affordable, accessible, and person-focused healthcare. Next slide, please. So, relevant to equity and leadership, we're very committed to our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. We are committed to attracting top talent to serve our customers. We know that by bringing together individuals with diverse skills, backgrounds, and abilities, we're better able to serve our members and communities. We have several employee resource groups, which focus both on employee development and business strategy. We've created a leadership program for leaders of these ERGs, and we host annual listening sessions with our senior executive team and these groups. DEI is very closely linked to our cause and our values. They are key to ensuring more equitable healthcare as we work to improve long-term community health and individual lives. Next slide, please. With reference to our work to advance health equity, this is a strategic focus area for our family of companies. Through innovative strategies and targeted investments, we are working to advance health equity for our members, our communities, and our employees. Some examples of what this looks like in action. We have enhanced our provider network and provider search tool to enable folks to connect with culturally responsive care providers. We've expanded our network of behavioral and mental health providers to address culturally specific care needs, as well as to increase access. And we're very invested in leveraging data to identify where there may be adverse differences in experience, quality, and access of care. Next slide, please. And to close out, this is specifically relevant to the conversation today, but our health plans are also working to diversify medical research by partnering with the National Institute of Health's All of Us research program. Historically, medical research has focused heavily on white people and white men in particular. And this has resulted in a lack of knowledge about many others, including LGBTQ+ community, communities of color, and specific ethnic groups. Similarly, people with lower income, less education, and those who live without consistent access to healthcare have largely been excluded from these studies. So by collecting data on a vast and more diverse group, we can help fill those gaps and provide scientists with the information they need to develop better treatments that are tailored to specific individuals. So overall, whether it's through our health equity work with health plan members, creating a workplace where everyone belongs, or addressing health disparities through philanthropy, CAMBIA is committed to serving equity for everyone we serve. And again, thank you for allowing us to be a part of this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Michael Ann. I appreciate it. Okay. So this program is about diversity in clinical trials. Oregon is home to more than 500 active clinical trials with nearly 9,000 Oregonians participating. This creates thousands of jobs and more than $450 million economic impact for the state. Recruiting participants in clinical trials is a key factor for clinical research success, and the diversity of participants plays a critical role. However, enhancing diversity in clinical trials is a challenge for many Oregon clinical trial researchers. In our panel discussion today, we'll be bringing together an Oregon clinical researcher and a representative from the biopharmaceutical industry to explain some of the challenges of engaging diverse participants and the efforts to address the systemic barriers that can deter underserved communities from participating. So I'm pleased to introduce our panel. Our first guest is Mary Nwokedi. Mary is a pharmacist by training and is currently the Director of Diversity in Clinical Trials at PhRMA, the U.S. Industry Association representing the country's leading innovative biopharmaceutical research companies, devoted to discovering and developing medicines that enable patients to live longer, healthier, and more productive lives. In this role, she's worked in clinical trial diversity initiatives that aim to bridge the gap between patients and novel drug development programs. Thank you for being here, Mary. And next we have Curt Heiting from Synergy Research and Development. He's also a member of Oregon Alliance of Clinical Researchers. President, co-founder, partner, and managing research director of Synergy Research, Curt is responsible for the business operations, financial performance, marketing, and compliance of the company, along with setting strategic direction. Prior to co-founding Synergy Research, Curt spent more than 20 years in the pharmaceutical sector, accumulated through his tenure with Pfizer, Merck, and Bristol Myers Squibb. Curt strives to cultivate direct involvement in the clinical development of both therapeutic and medical devices that address medical needs that are not currently being met. Welcome, Curt.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm moderating this panel today. Let's pin our panelists so we can see them. Curt, Mary, and myself. Great. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. We're going to start off with Curt. Curt's going to do a presentation, and then Mary will do a presentation, and then we'll do some Q&A. So if you have questions for the presenters, please type them into the chat, and we'll be getting to those a little bit later. Please, Curt, you have the floor.
Thank you, and welcome to all the panelists. And I appreciate being part of this particular lecture. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to just give a brief overview of clinical research, in the state of Oregon and abroad. As Renee had mentioned, I am the founder of Synergy Research. We are a standalone, dedicated clinical research site in Portland, Oregon. We have been involved in clinical research for about 24 years in a vast array of clinical indications and research studies. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what a clinical trial is. A clinical trial or clinical trials are basically types of research that study and test treatments and evaluate their effects on human health outcomes. So in simple terms, clinical trials help determine if an agent or device is safe and effective for people to use. Clinical trials may also be designed to discover new ways of using existing treatments. It is not uncommon to see a repositioning, or we'll say a repurposing of existing treatments in clinical research. Basically existing therapies for alternative disease indications. An example of this would be research for, say, cancer indications. The primary goal of repurposed therapies is focused on efficacy with less restriction on safety due to the immediate need to treat this patient population. Clinical trials may be designed to test new agents, combinations of medications or drugs, or new ways to perform medical procedures or interventions. There are such things as preventative or prevention studies in clinical research that evaluate better ways to prevent disease or prevent a disease from coming back. An example of this would be, vaccine studies, vaccine research, or behavior interventions or medications. Since the introduction of COVID in our environment, there's been an immense amount of preventative studies in COVID research, and I have been involved in a majority of those studies since those studies began. And this is the type of research that we will continue to do over time, because there's a lot to learn about COVID and the variations and arms of COVID. So that research will continue for some time to come. Another preventative example would be in indications such as diabetes. Many of the preventative diabetes related studies that have been conducted over the years may show that basically a reduction in weight and increase in exercise both lead to rapid changes in glucose metabolism. Supporting that lifestyle changes that are maintained over time can reduce the onset of diabetes. So that's another example of a preventative clinical trial. There are diagnostic studies in clinical research that are performed to find better methods of diagnosing diseases or conditions. A diagnostic trial generally used in two different ways. A diagnostic trial type 1 describes a study that evaluate accuracy of a diagnostic test in detecting disease or severity. In a diagnostic type 2 trial, the downstream consequences of the test followed by the treatment decisions are evaluated together in a joint construct. These types of diagnostic randomized clinical trials or test treatment trials are considered kind of the gold standard of proof for the clinical effectiveness of a clinical utility or diagnostic test. And we're seeing a lot of these new types of diagnostic clinical trials, to determine whether a patient may be positive for, say, COVID-19, along with influenza A and B. These are pretty consistent types of trials that we see on the market from year to year. Another example of a clinical trial is a quality of life trial or study. And this type of study is designed to explore and evaluate ways to improve the comfort and quality of life for people with chronic illnesses or conditions. You find a lot of quality of life studies in cancer research as an example. These quality of life studies usually are assessed by looking at disease-free survival, progression-free survival, and overall survival, and can be measured in years, months, even weeks. Other markers of quality of life studies may look at general health, personal life, study, work, hobbies, leisure, family, friends, and other general aspects. Clinical research, the type of clinical research that I do and a lot of my colleagues do are certainly different than laboratory research. Clinical research involves people to help us better understand medicine and health, where laboratory research doesn't involve people at that particular stage. Every medication or drug, device, tool, diagnostic test, technique, and technology used in medicine today was once tested in volunteers who took part in clinical trials. And I'll kind of circle back on the volunteer aspect of what we do. The types of research that Synergy Research, which is my organization, are involved in, along with many other of my colleagues in the state of Oregon, are more the standard phase 1 through phase 4 clinical trials. And I'm going to kind of dissect between those particular phases. Phase 1 clinical research usually tests new drugs for the first time in small groups of people to evaluate and identify the safe dose range and identify potential side effects. Then we move to phase 2 clinical research studies, and those particular studies test treatments that have been found to be safe in phase 1, but now need a larger group of human subjects to monitor for adverse events. Then we progress to phase 3 clinical trials, and those particular studies are conducted on a larger population in different regions and countries, and are often the step right before the new treatment is approved. And that's a lot of what we've seen in a lot of these COVID FDA-approved studies in the last couple of years, that quick progression from phase 1, phase 2 to phase 3. And then there's phase 4 clinical research, and those particular studies take place after a particular country has approved that medication, and there's a need for further testing in a wider population over longer timeframes. I anticipate we're going to see a lot more phase 4 research with COVID-19 to determine long-term safety and effects in the future. So how do we learn about the clinical research in the state of Oregon that's being conducted? There's actually a more comprehensive resource that's been around for a couple of years now in the state of Oregon that was launched. And this resource is the Oregon Alliance of Clinical Researchers. So this is a conglomerate of industry supporters, clinical researchers within our state that have all been involved in the creation of this particular website, which delivers educational resources and support to the public to access, learn, and gather information about research within our state. The public access for this website, you can all find it online at orclinicalresearch.com. And this website is really designed for the patient. Going back to the volunteers and the patient, it's very important for the success of clinical research to have involvement with our patient demographic. And this is an access point for our patients within the community or the state of Oregon to access and research the active clinical trials, with many of the active clinical trials within the state of Oregon. And on the OACR website, there is, again, accessing local patient advocacy groups. We can learn more about the active studies from one clinical site to another within our state. Patients can go online, and there's actually a search tool that allows them to put in a search for based on location, based on age, maybe it's based on a disease or condition, and they can more drill down what active clinical research trials or potential upcoming research trials might be available to them within their area or location, along with contact information for the research sites that are involved in that particular research. Now, circling back on clinical trials and their critical role they play in medical research, innovative discoveries and breakthroughs, clinical trials and the benefit they bring to the human population would not be possible without the participation of volunteers. And this is very critical. Unfortunately, clinical trials are often under-enrolled. About 30% or 37% of clinical trials do not enroll enough patients to even move forward. So that's why patient participation is so important and critical in helping prevent, diagnose, and cure diseases and illnesses. The value to the participant in a clinical trial is that the patient is contributing to research that could bring new treatments one step closer to reaching patients across the nation or the world for that matter. The trial may not only help advance science of that participant and their disease or illness, but it could also make progress for related areas of science. So there's an immense importance of getting information out to our communities as to what clinical research is, how patients can participate, the value of participation to the better good of advancing science. Another important aspect of participating in a clinical trial or research trials is diversity, which plays a very prominent role. Inclusion of broad patient populations, for an example, participants of different races, ethnic groups, sex, genders, ages, or those with rare conditions help provide evidence that the study or study medication or device for that matter will be safe and effective in a wider targeted patient pool if approved. That being said, as we're talking about diversity, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the discussion to Mary, who's going to talk further about the importance and value of diversity in clinical research. And I think we'll be circling back with any questions at the end of our discussions. Mary?
Thank you, Curt. That was very informative. And also thank you for CAMBIA Health and Nwokedi for hosting this panel. I'm really glad to share PhRMA's efforts in the clinical trial diversity space. Just want to double check for my slides being, okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so just a little bit of background on PhRMA. PhRMA, which stands for the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, is a voluntary nonprofit association that represents the country's leading biopharmaceutical research and biotechnology companies. So PhRMA member companies have invested more than $1 trillion in search for new treatments and cures, and it is heavily invested in increasing patient access to clinical trials through our clinical trial diversity initiative. And just as Curt had mentioned, 30% of trials don't enroll enough patients. So it's really important to ensure that we cast that wider net to get as many patients in clinical trials who are qualified for those trials. Next slide, please. So when we began the clinical trial diversity initiative, we realized the effort requires an understanding of the barriers and limitations to our current clinical trial system. So one of the first steps that we had to think about when approaching an issue as large and multifaceted as diverse enrollment in clinical trials is really truly understanding some of the underlying systemic societal barriers to participation in clinical trials. So PhRMA has convened thousands of stakeholders from advocacy organizations, patient groups, academic partners, church leaders, industry partners, and experts, among others, to really get a better understanding of those barriers faced. And so this slide is by no means a comprehensive list of the barriers that are faced by patients trying to enroll in a clinical trial, but it does provide that framework for the systemic issues witnessed today in the current clinical trial ecosystem. So we have learned that the limitations to access in underrepresented communities We've learned of limited public awareness, often caused by limited access to education of available trials for qualifying patients, and also just limited access to sites and healthcare providers that are directly involved in clinical trials. So patients having to travel outside of their communities to even have access or information about clinical trials. And then lastly, that lack of diverse investigators and staff involved in clinical trials that can recommend patients into clinical trials. We also saw that being asked to participate in clinical trials can also rely on the incidence data in underserved communities. And that lack of data to support increased enrollment of diverse populations stands as a systemic issue to clinical trial diversity. And additionally, patients who are enrolled in clinical trials may face both financial and time burdens that may not be affordable to more individuals from underrepresented backgrounds and populations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our industry is really committed to addressing barriers that prevent clinical trial access for underrepresented communities. But we're also keenly aware that partnerships with key players in the healthcare/clinical trial ecosystem can create a more cohesive effort to addressing the barriers on a community level while enhancing diversity in clinical trials. And so realizing that the barriers to clinical trials stem from that fundamental lack of access, the biopharmaceutical industry has in large part organized together to help address these barriers. So our 31 member companies realized that a new approach is needed and to address the current issues. And this approach takes the strength of multiple industries to address many of those systemic barriers. Next slide, please. So in an effort to engage across the clinical trial system, PhRMA has engaged member companies and external stakeholders on this renewed industry-wide effort to enhance clinical trial diversity. So as I mentioned before, we convened thousands of stakeholders as well, exploring a new proposed industry collaboration with diverse communities, health systems, and academia that really seeks to show proof of concept of a network of connected community-based clinical trial sites. And so we had strong support from our member companies and the pharmaceutical company members. And this effort really seeks to create a sustainable community-based infrastructure focused on clinical trial diversity that increases access, addresses systemic barriers to participation, and addresses that deeply rooted mistrust that can keep many or some from participating in clinical trials. And so this effort builds off of our principles on enhancing clinical trial diversity that PhRMA and our member companies voluntarily developed and adopted in the fall of 2020. And so just last year, we officially launched the proposed infrastructure as the Equitable Breakthroughs in Medicine Development, which is this community-based effort. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when we think about addressing the systemic barriers to clinical trial access, a kind of a consistently repeated point came from many of our stakeholders, which was that we needed this to be very community focused or a community-based effort. And therefore, this initiative really is focused on a complete paradigm shift. So when we think about barriers to access, especially in novel drug treatments through clinical trials, a significant issue is that lack of that community-based infrastructure that creates that bridge between clinical trial access and underrepresented communities. So this paradigm shift is necessary to address the current model of clinical trials, kind of parachuting into communities and health systems and right back out when the trial is over. Therefore, addressing the clinical trial sites with varying capabilities and readiness was met by creating an infrastructure that creates a network of robust communication, community relations, ongoing site training and mentoring, and sustainable support and standardized platforms and metrics. And so by providing these elements, the hope is to create a sustainable community-based infrastructure that directly address many of those barriers to access. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, this proposed community-based infrastructure launched as the Equitable Breakthroughs in Medicine Development last July. It is in development, but it will be open to the public for sponsor participation. It's currently in development for that opening process. The coordinating partners that will oversee this infrastructure are Morehouse School of Medicine, Yale School of Medicine, Vanderbilt, and RCMI, which is the Research Center of Minority Institutions. Additional partners are being added on to the infrastructure as we speak to really help create more of a diverse partnership that will help address many of those barriers discussed earlier in this presentation. And so this group will lead what we are calling the learning phase of the Equitable Breakthroughs in Medicine Development, and to address many of those barriers to clinical trial access in underrepresented communities. And that's my last slide. We could maybe go back to questions.
All right, let me unmute. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Curt. I appreciate your this great information. It looks like this program with PhRMA has been in the works for a couple of years, so congratulations on getting that going. That's really wonderful and much needed. So we have questions in the chat. I'm just going to go ahead and start reading some of the questions out. The first question we have is cancer risk increases with age. So is it age discrimination for screening tools to set limits that exclude elderly who are more likely to get cancers? Whoever wants to grab that one.
Mary might be better suited for that one.
I was actually going to defer to you.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's a good question. You know, it's a slippery slope when you really, in clinical research, you can't segregate by, you know, certainly by age or a variety of other measures. I mean, it really comes down to the science, the indication, the overall goal of trying to find a better way and a safer way to treat those patients. You know, research evolves, and in the evolution of research, that evolution can expand into a variety of other age demographics. It may start in one particular demographic, and it may continue in a variety of other age ranges. So, you know, I think it comes down to each particular patient and what type of criteria they meet within the clinical trial structure. And then once we evolve through the progression of that disease state and the research, you know, we have the opportunity to potentially expand that that particular research out to varying demographics and varying age ranges and a more diverse group. There's no set answer to that question when it comes to discrimination. I think we all have to keep an open mind, and we have to look at the greater good of the research and the science to continue to evolve and expand that research out to, you know, a greater good of the human population. I don't know if that directly answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Mary, unless you have anything to add, I'll go to the next question.
I don't have anything to add. That was a great answer. Thanks,
Okay,
Curt.
good. Thank you. The next question is, the recently passed Federal Infrastructure Act and the rural development programs of the Department of Agriculture now have support for the development and funding for broadband services in all areas of the U.S., especially rural areas and reservation nations. What role can telehealth play in enrolling underrepresented people, communities, and groups in studies, as well as their local health clinics or ongoing clinical trials? And how can the bioscience incubator or Regents Healthcare support the expansion of broadband, use of electronics monitoring, and telehealth for research? That's a lot of questions. Let's take one at a time. What role can telehealth play in clinical trials and you know, enrolling people into these programs?
Yeah.
Oh, I can go ahead, Mary, if you want to start this out. Or
Okay, I could start. And I think during the COVID clinical trials, we saw really flexible clinical trials. So the role of telehealth, I think, has a really special and expanded role in reaching individuals who may not have access to clinical trial sites within their range. So I think looking at the expanded access for broadband services in areas in rural areas, reservations is a key role to ensuring that those individuals who were normally didn't have access to clinical trials or larger health systems can be reached and enrolled in those clinical trials.
Yeah, because this is one of the systemic barriers on your slides is the limited access to trials in underrepresented communities. This helps bridge that gap and make it available to more folks.
Absolutely.
I think we are seeing a paradigm shift where there's more telehealth involved, as Mary mentioned, in current and future clinical research. We know that that's just it has been a barrier, and I think it opens up a much wider range of involvement from the community in those underserved areas to be involved. And so I only see that becoming more of a benefit and a value to those communities and the overall progression of clinical research.
Yeah, excellent. Another question we have is, what best practices do you recommend for using the voice of a patient to educate other patients about trials to reach diverse populations? And are there any funding sources to support this kind of approach?
I could take a stab at this question. So yeah, I think some of the best practices is really to what we had talked about quite a bit was listening to the communities. So understanding what the communities are hesitant about in clinical trials and really using their community leaders to educate them on the access issues to clinical trials and some of those barriers that can be overcome with the current funding that is in multiple different programs, including what we're trying to put in the equitable breakthroughs in medicine development. I'm not sure of all of the multiple funding approaches or sources. I know quite a bit of funding came in during COVID on how to access patients and educate patients on the importance of joining clinical trials. But I think that if we have a more concerted effort to ensure that we are listening to the communities that we want to engage with clinical trials and then utilize their expertise to reach out to underrepresented populations.
Great, thank you. Curt?
Yeah, and the voice of the voice of the patient and their experience and their story to their family, to their friends, to their community is invaluable. I mean, it really is. That just further extends out to a greater population and demographic. And coming from the patient, again, that's so much more valuable because their experience is unique to them, but others might be able to relate to that. So anytime we can advocate for our patients to speak in the community or get their experience out in any way of communication, it benefits the overall good of clinical research.
Yes. Good. We've got lots of questions in here, so this is great. Curt, I did put a link in the chat to the Oregon Alliance of Clinical Researchers website, as well as the Clinical Trial Finder tool. So I was
Wonderful.
looking at that just yesterday, and there's all kinds of trials out there. That's a great tool.
There are, and I hope that the community gains more exposure to that resource. It's an evolving resource that's frequently being updated and insight to future studies coming to the state of Oregon. So it really is a great platform that we haven't had in the past. That is just another great tool and resource.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's see here. We've got another. Scroll back just a little bit. Got all kinds of questions coming. Okay. How do you suggest involvement of physicians and healthcare providers, particularly in underrepresented groups or communities for both men and women? How do you suggest involving their physicians to get folks into clinical trials? And do you enlist other healthcare workers, in addition to physicians, nurses, and social workers, therapists, peer counselors, to help inform their groups that there are trials happening? And are there other listings in other states on the National Institutes of Health's website?
I can take a stab at that one as well. I think that's part of the groundwork that we need to continue to improve upon, as we need to get information and resources out to the patient population, underserved communities. We also need to do a better job at getting the information out to the local, regional, national physicians, because a lot of physicians are so overtaxed in their private practices or the medical groups. They don't have the capacity to bring on a research arm, yet they may have a diverse patient population that could highly benefit from that. So as we're focusing on getting information and resources out to the community, we also need to continue to strive to get information out to the medical associations, in each state around the country, to get more involved, because I think there is a value to the more physicians and patient populations that we can get involved into the umbrella of clinical research. We can all accomplish so much more than we are today.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mary. I was just going to ask if PhRMA has any involvement in that.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Curt. With Equitable Breakthroughs Medicine, one of the kind of pillars of the initiative is to task individuals and communities and healthcare providers and communities to reach more diverse patient populations. So I completely agree that private practice physicians may not have the capacity at this point to have a research arm. So ensuring that they have enough resources and funding to perhaps expand that capabilities and utilize their RNs to expand those research capabilities. And so I think it's just really important to ensure that we are targeting communities and targeting healthcare providers and communities that we would like to see more participation in clinical trials, rather than asking individuals to travel to larger health systems in order to participate.
Yeah, absolutely, because that's a huge barrier in a lot of ways. And it was interesting, I thought, Curt, that Curt mentioned earlier, that many clinical trials don't fill and can't go forward. I didn't know that. That's disappointing. So any way that the word can get out is good. We have another question. The FDA released a draft guidance on clinical trial diversity last year. Can you discuss what that covers and the general expectations for pharmaceutical and other sponsors?
Yeah, and I could take a stab at that one. So FDA released a draft guidance on diversity plans, and this was kind of a follow-up to the previous guidance on their clinical trial diversity guidance. So ultimately, the FDA did lay out what they would expect from pharmaceutical companies and drug sponsors to submit with their applications in order to tackle that diversity issue during their clinical trials. So I don't have the layout on what exactly was included, but it did include standard issue or standard barriers that we see in clinical trials, and a kind of a plan of action on how companies would tackle those issues. And so the expectation is for drug sponsors to submit a diversity plan with their IND, I believe.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Boy, we've got some great questions here in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for submitting questions. This is wonderful. The next question is, how do you overcome historical distrust from communities who have suffered from experimentation rather than inclusion in research? And along those lines, how are patients protected during clinical trials? Mary, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I think this is probably one of the larger issues when we're talking about diversity in clinical trials is overcoming that mistrust. As I said before, I really do believe that listening to the communities and engaging with communities to understand some of those barriers to mistrust. One thing that we heard time and time again was having a healthcare provider in your community that's referring you to a trial. That increases the amount of trust for a trial because it's someone that you've probably been working with or visiting over the course of years or decades. So ensuring that we have a diverse population of healthcare providers that can refer individuals into clinical trials. And I also wanted to touch upon some points that were brought up by many of our patient advocacy groups and stakeholders was that sometimes it's not even about the mistrust, it's the fact that they're not even aware of clinical trials that they would be qualified for. So if you're failing a standard treatment, or one or two standard treatments, and you don't even know where to get the information on clinical trials. So it's kind of that balancing act of ensuring that there's enough information out there for patients, but also ensuring that they have access to that information as well.
Yeah. Curt, anything to add on this one?
I think Mary spelled this out very well. One of the hindering rationales is just that we all need to continue to work together to get into the communities and the underserved communities with the information that we have available. As I mentioned earlier, the Oregon Alliance of Clinical Research is a great tool and resource, but we need more than that. We really need physicians and research investors and other national organizations to all work together in their independent communities to gain more insight of what types of resources do those communities lack and what can we bring to the table to help get more information out to the value of clinical research and the opportunities for some of those communities to partake in. I think we have a long way to go to continue to work together as a larger conglomerate to meet some of those goals.
Yeah. Okay, we've got just a few more questions. This one is to Mary. Once the information is shared to the public, will it be distributed to the healthcare and research industry? And if so, how will it be distributed?
Yeah, so the lead coordinating partners for the Equitable Breakthroughs in Medicine Development, Morehouse, Yale, Vanderbilt, and RCMI have touch points in both the healthcare industry as well as research industry as well as the pharmaceutical industry. So the plan is to have a wide distribution on how sponsors can engage in what we are terming as the learning phase. How it will be distributed is still being operationalized and determined. And so more information to come. And hopefully there'll be a landing site where we can share some of that information, but that is still in the works at the moment.
Okay, is Health and Human Services involved in any of these equity initiatives?
Not directly involved, but we did hold a clinical trial diversity workshop, and I believe there are representatives from the Health and Human Services. So we did have a lot of stakeholder engagement from many of those federal agencies.
Okay. Okay, we've got two more questions. The first one is, to what degree are inclusion and exclusion criteria for clinical trials contributing to the lack of diversity?
I can take a stab at that one. Certainly, inclusion exclusion criteria is kind of the make or break of a patient's involvement, and that criteria is pretty defined, and in many cases, depending on the type of clinical trial and the design, some are much more difficult to enroll than others, and typically a sponsor or a pharmaceutical company who designs that particular protocol, as they submit that to the FDA, there are certain criteria that have to be met and followed. But that's where us as clinical researchers and sites tend to be challenged, by that inclusion. We still want to find the right patients for the right studies that may qualify without segregating any particular demographic. It's just getting that information out. We only have so many databases to work with. So the more that we can get out to our communities and try to dissect through the needs and the type of patients that we have in our community that may benefit, that's where we're lacking. And again, I think we need greater resources, greater unity within the state and broken down to the county, broken down to rural areas. There's a lot of work to be done there, but criteria can be difficult, and it appears, in my opinion, that inclusion exclusion criteria is becoming more and more difficult in clinical research than I've seen maybe 10 years ago. But usually that's for a reason. It's drilling down to the complexities of the disease state, or it's drilling down to the type of patients and demographics that we're seeing out there. There's a lot of balls that are rolling in that particular arena to try to better answer that question.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add on that the last FDA draft guidance that was released on diversity plans did touch upon inclusion and exclusion criteria and really adjusting those potentially without risking, obviously, the scientific soundness of the clinical trial to help enroll a more diverse patient population. So that may be a good resource as well to learn about what is being done, at least from the FDA front.
Okay, great. There's a comment in the chat. Someone said, I've heard that during the height of HIV, clinical trials were conducted in community settings outside of the large urban settings and academic centers. And it seems that we need to make it easier for a provider or site outside of these large institutions to participate. Sounds like it's been done before, so perhaps revisit some of those HIV trials to see how they were able to reach the broader populations and areas.
Great feedback.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, good. And then there is one more question. How can the public at large in this community plant the seeds that this work is being done? How can we all spread the word?
Yeah, and I know for PhRMA, at least on our initiatives, we have quite a bit of resources on our website. We'd be glad to share with the organizers to send out externally on just education on what is being done, at least from the biopharmaceutical perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will be, this program is being recorded. I'll send out a recording in a couple of days. I would be happy to include any of that information to all of our registrants so that they receive that information and then they can share it with others. And the recordings of these lunch and learns live on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. So they're available to share, to watch again. And so again, spreading the word is what we're here for. Well, any last words? We're just about at the top of the hour, so I just wanted to ask if there's any last words that you have before we wrap up for today. Oh, Mary, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to thank you and the organizers on creating this lunch and learn. I think it's really important to spread the awareness of what is being done to really enhance diversity in clinical trials.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Mary. And Curt.
Yes, and I agree with Mary. We thank all of our partners and all of the participants. We all have to collectively work together for the greater good of the type of research that we do to evolve medicine. And I think there's so many moving parts that we're not aware of and so many moving parts that we're learning about. And it's about finding the resources and the team-oriented approach to evolve and get more people involved and to, at the end of the day, reach more patients out there and educate them on the resources that are available.
Yes. Well, thank you both for an outstanding discussion. We really appreciate it. And I know that we all took away a lot of thought-provoking words of wisdom, and also the fact that this is really in the beginning stages and has a ways to go. But we appreciate that this is being addressed. I want to thank once again CAMBIA Health Solutions for their support in this equity and leadership series. We're going to be holding one lunch and learn per quarter on a diversity, equity, and inclusion topic that's of interest to our audience. And I also want to thank our amazing panel, Mary and Curt. And through your work, we can help solve barriers to diversity in clinical trials and make them more reflective of our diverse patient population. So as I said, this has been recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out to all registrants by the end of the week. I thank you all for your support of the Oregon Bioscience Incubator, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.